This narrow strip of water is disrupting global trade, raising shipping costs and forcing the world's most powerful navies to respond. And yet, what is happening here is still widely misunderstood. The Red Sea is not suddenly important because a new conflict appeared. It matters because it exposed a weakness that was already there. For decades, this route functioned quietly in the background of the global system. Ships passed, goods moved, energy flowed, everything worked, not because the system was resilient, but because it had not been tested in the wrong way. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Global trade optimized for speed, efficiency, and predictability. It accepted concentration as the price of progress. And the Red Sea became one of the narrow points where the entire system compressed itself. When instability entered that space, the problem was not violence, it was fragility. Insurance rates spiked, shipping companies rerouted, governments issued reassurances and increased naval presence, not because a full war broke out, but because confidence broke. This is not a story about the Middle East alone. It is a story about how modern global trade really works, and how quickly it changes when a single assumption collapses. To understand why the Red Sea suddenly matters to everyone, we need to look beyond the headlines and into the structure that made this disruption inevitable. Geography as a trap. The Red Sea was never chosen because it was safe. It was chosen because it was efficient. For modern global trade, efficiency is everything. Distance matters, time matters, fuel matters, and above all, predictability matters. The Red Sea offered all of that in one narrow corridor. It shortened journeys between Europe and Asia by thousands of kilometers, turning weeks at sea into days saved. In economic terms, it was not just convenient. It was irresistible. That is how dependence begins. Once trade routes adapt to efficiency, they stop asking whether the system is resilient. They assume it is. Shipping companies design schedules around the shortest path. Ports invest in infrastructure that only makes sense if traffic keeps flowing. Entire supply chains are built on the expectation that this corridor will remain open. The Red Sea did not become important because of what surrounds it. It became important because the world reorganized itself around it. At the heart of this system is a simple geographic reality: constraint. The Red Sea is long, narrow, and unforgiving. At its southern end lies the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a passage so tight that nearly all traffic must funnel through it. There is no parallel lane, no overflow system, no redundancy built into the geography. If traffic slows here, it does not gradually disperse. It backs up. The alternative route, sailing around the southern tip of Africa, is not a true substitute. It adds enormous distance, fuel costs, crew time, insurance exposure, and logistical uncertainty. For companies operating on thin margins and precise schedules, that detour is not a backup plan. It is a last resort. This is where geography becomes a trap. The global system optimized itself for speed, not shock resistance. Every decision made sense in isolation. Shorter routes reduced costs. Concentrated flows increased efficiency. Scale rewarded those who moved fastest. But efficiency creates fragility. The more traffic depends on a single corridor, the more damage is caused when that corridor is questioned. The Red Sea is not fragile because it is narrow. It is fragile because too much depends on it working perfectly all the time. For decades, this risk was accepted, not because it was invisible, but because it felt abstract. Nothing catastrophic happened. Ships passed, goods arrived. The system reinforced its own confidence, until it didn't. The moment doubt entered the system, the same efficiency that made the Red Sea indispensable turned it into a pressure point. A narrow passage that once saved time became a bottleneck that threatened everything built on top of it. This is the first rule of modern geopolitics. When movement is concentrated, power and vulnerability concentrate with it. And the Red Sea sits exactly where the world chose to compress itself. The illusion of stability. For decades, the Red Sea appeared stable, not because it was free of tension, but because nothing forced the system to confront its own weakness. This is how fragile systems survive, not by being safe, but by avoiding decisive shocks. The region surrounding the Red Sea has never been calm. Conflicts, rivalries, and political instability were always present. Yet global trade continued to move through the corridor with remarkable consistency. Ships passed, schedules held, markets adjusted. And over time, this repetition created an assumption that whatever risks existed were manageable. That assumption was reinforced by routine. Shipping companies operate on probability, not fear. As long as disruptions remained rare and localized, they were treated as operational noise rather than systemic threats. Occasional incidents were absorbed by insurance. Minor delays were offset elsewhere. The system learned how to normalize risk without questioning its foundation. This created what economists call path dependence. Once a route becomes dominant, everything around it adapts to keep it dominant. Ports expand. Fleets are designed for specific distances. Supply chains become tightly timed. Any alternative route starts to look inefficient by comparison, even if it is safer. Over time, stability becomes a habit. The Red Sea did not prove its resilience. It benefited from the absence of failure. And absence of failure is not the same as strength. What kept the illusion alive was predictability. Even when tensions rose, they followed familiar patterns. Threats were understood. Boundaries were clear. Companies could price risk because risk behaved consistently. That predictability mattered more than peace. Global trade does not require calm waters. It requires known waters. As long as the Red Sea behaved according to expectation, the system trusted it. Each successful passage reinforced the belief that the corridor would continue to function. Tomorrow, next month, next year. This is where the illusion solidified. Because once a system operates without interruption for long enough, its users stop seeing it as vulnerable. Risk becomes theoretical. Warnings become background noise. Contingency planning becomes optional. The Red Sea became infrastructure rather than exposure. And infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. What made this illusion dangerous was not ignorance but confidence. The belief that past performance guaranteed future stability. The belief that the system had endured because it was robust, rather than because it had simply not been tested in the wrong way. That belief would not survive the next shift. And when it broke quickly. Because in systems built on confidence, stability does not erode gradually. It collapses the moment predictability disappears. What actually changed? What changed in the Red Sea was not geography, and it was not the sudden appearance of conflict. What changed was how risk began to be calculated by governments, by insurers, and most importantly, by the companies that move global trade. For years, tensions around the Red Sea were treated as background conditions. They were serious but familiar. Shipping companies knew where danger existed. Insurers knew how to price it. Governments knew how to contain it. The system functioned because uncertainty stayed inside known limits. That boundary broke. A sequence of attacks, threats, and escalating signals pushed the Red Sea out of the category of managed risk and into something far more disruptive: unpredictable exposure. This distinction matters more than any single incident. Global trade does not collapse when risks exist. It collapses when risks can no longer be modeled. In response, major powers moved quickly, not because they wanted headlines, but because they understood what was at stake. The United States increased naval activity aimed at protecting commercial shipping and restoring confidence. European countries with direct interests in trade flows also reinforced their posture. The United Kingdom and France increased their visible role in maritime security efforts, while other European partners supported the broader objective of keeping routes open and predictable. At the regional level, the stakes are even more immediate. Egypt has a direct interest in the stability of the Suez-linked route. Saudi Arabia sits on the eastern side of the corridor and watches any escalation as a strategic risk. The United Arab Emirates, built around logistics and trade, has an obvious incentive to keep maritime routes stable. On the opposite shore, countries like Djibouti matter not because they dominate global politics, but because geography places them near a bottleneck the world cannot ignore. Each actor projects a message: deterrence, control, stability. But global trade does not respond to messaging, it responds to exposure. Shipping companies and insurers do not ask whether navies are present. They ask whether a route can be trusted under all conditions, including escalation, miscalculation, and spillover. For them, intent is irrelevant. Only probability matters, and once that probability shifts, behavior changes fast. Insurance premiums rise before routes close. Schedules change before ports shut down. Detours begin before governments declare emergencies. This is why perception can matter more than reality. The Red Sea did not suddenly become unusable. It became unreliable. Reliability is the invisible foundation of modern trade. Entire industries depend on shipments, arriving inside narrow time windows. Warehouses operate with minimal inventory. Manufacturers rely on components arriving exactly when needed. When reliability disappears, efficiency turns into liability. Detours add weeks. Fuel costs rise. Crews stay at sea longer. Insurance exposure grows with every additional mile traveled. And once companies adapt to that new reality, they do not reverse course easily. Governments may promise stability. Naval patrols may expand. Diplomatic statements may multiply. But confidence, once broken, is expensive to rebuild. Corporate decision-makers don't operate on reassurance. They operate on worst-case scenarios. They remember the moment the system stopped behaving as expected. The Red Sea crossed that threshold, and once a choke point is reclassified as unreliable, the system doesn't wait to see if things improve. It assumes they won't and moves accordingly. Why Europe and Asia feel it first. Disruptions in the Red Sea do not affect everyone equally. Some regions feel the pressure almost immediately, not because they are closer geographically, but because they are structurally dependent on the flow that passes through this corridor. Europe is one of them. A significant share of European trade with Asia moves through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Energy imports, industrial components, consumer goods, all depend on predictable maritime schedules. Countries like Germany, Italy, and France rely heavily on uninterrupted shipping to keep manufacturing cycles running smoothly. When delays occur, factories do not stop instantly, but pressure accumulates quietly. That pressure shows up as higher costs, slower delivery times, and reduced flexibility. Europe's vulnerability is not ideological, it is logistical. Unlike regions with more diversified maritime access, Europe's trade routes converge sharply around a few key passages. When one of them becomes unreliable, alternatives are limited, slower, and more expensive. The Red Sea is not just a shortcut for Europe, it is a structural necessity. Asia feels the impact from the opposite direction. Countries like China, South Korea, and Japan are major producers for European markets. Their export models depend on scale, speed, and efficiency. A disruption in the Red Sea stretches delivery timelines and complicates inventory planning thousands of kilometers away. Factories may continue to produce, But uncertainty increases across the supply chain. Components arrive later, finished goods sit longer in transit. Capital remains tied up at sea instead of circulating through the economy. For export-driven economies, that friction matters. The longer goods spend in transit, the higher the cost of doing business. And those costs rarely stay contained within logistics companies. They ripple outward to distributors, retailers, and eventually consumers. This is how a maritime choke point becomes a household issue. Consumers in Europe and Asia may never see the Red Sea, but they feel it when prices rise, choices narrow, or deliveries slow. What makes this dynamic particularly dangerous is timing. Modern supply chains operate with minimal buffers. Inventory is optimized for efficiency, not resilience. When disruptions occur, there is little margin for error. Small delays stack into larger problems. And once companies adapt to a slower, more expensive route, those adjustments do not disappear overnight. This is why Europe and Asia feel the consequences first. Not because they are weak, but because they are deeply integrated into a system that was designed for speed, not shock. The Red Sea exposes that design choice. And in doing so, it reveals a broader truth about globalization. The regions that benefit most from efficiency are also the ones that pay the highest price when it breaks. Power shifts without headlines. When trade routes destabilize, power does not disappear. It shifts. And most of that shift happens quietly, without headlines or dramatic announcements. The Red Sea is a perfect example of how influence can change hands without a single border moving. Countries with strong naval capabilities gain leverage, not because they seek confrontation, but because their presence becomes a form of insurance. The United States, with its global naval reach, can project stability in ways few others can. The United Kingdom and France, both with blue water navies and long-standing maritime interests, gain relevance simply by being able to operate far from home. Their ships do not need to fire a shot. Their presence alone alters calculations. At the same time, regional countries positioned near the choke point gain disproportionate importance. Egypt, which controls access to the Suez Canal, becomes more than a transit state. It becomes a gatekeeper. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, both with coastlines tied to critical routes, see their strategic value increase as trade uncertainty grows. Even smaller states matter more when geography places them close to pressure points. Djibouti, for example, does not shape global policy, but its location near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait makes it relevant in ways that far exceed its size. This is how power works in logistical systems. Influence follows flow, and when flow is threatened, those who can protect, reroute, or control it gain leverage. Meanwhile, others absorb the cost. Shipping companies lose efficiency. Import-dependent economies face higher prices. Consumers experience inflation without ever hearing the name of the route that caused it. This redistribution of power is not temporary. It reshapes behavior. Governments adjust priorities. Companies redesign supply chains. Navies justify expanded presence. And once these adjustments are made, they tend to persist, even if immediate tensions fade. What makes this shift difficult to reverse is that it is not driven by ideology or diplomacy, but by risk management. Companies and governments remember where vulnerabilities were exposed. The Red Sea becomes a reference point, not as a crisis, but as a lesson. It teaches a simple rule of modern geopolitics. Control over movement can matter as much as control over territory. And that control does not always require force. Sometimes it only requires being in the right place when others cannot afford uncertainty. This is why the most significant consequences of Red Sea instability are not dramatic battles or political speeches. They are quiet recalculations that determine who gains influence, who pays more, and who adapts, long after the headlines move on. Why this is not temporary? The world rarely changes all at once. It changes at narrow points, places where pressure builds quietly until it can no longer be ignored. The Red Sea is one of those places. Not because it is new, not because it is unusually violent, but because modern global systems were built on the assumption that movement would remain uninterrupted. That assumption no longer holds. What makes the Red Sea situation significant is not the presence of risk. Risk has always existed. It is the realization that efficiency was prioritized over resilience, and that the margin for error was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Once that realization sets in, systems do not simply return to normal. Companies adapt, governments adjust, routes are reconsidered, costs are recalculated, and most importantly, trust does not reset overnight. The Red Sea becomes more than a route. It becomes a reference point, a reminder that global trade depends on a handful of corridors, and that each one carries far more power and vulnerability than maps suggest. This is why the impact of Red Sea instability will outlast the immediate crisis. Not because ships will stop moving forever, but because the rules by which they move have changed. Efficiency is no longer enough, predictability is no longer guaranteed, and resilience suddenly matters more than speed. The same lesson applies far beyond this region. The Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Taiwan Strait. Each represents a similar gamble, a place where the global system concentrates itself in the name of efficiency, and in doing so exposes itself to disruption. The Red Sea did not create this reality, it revealed it, and once revealed, it cannot be unseen. This is why the Red Sea suddenly matters to everyone, not as a headline, not as a regional conflict, but as a structural fault line in how the modern world moves, trades, and distributes power. The next disruption may occur elsewhere, but the lesson will be the same. When movement is concentrated, vulnerability concentrates with it, and the world is now far more aware of how narrow its margins really are.